Hello and welcome. My name is Miki and this is Compendium Trivia, your one-stop shop for fascinating facts from the world of history and geography. Do you love pub quizzes and late-night map explorations? Then you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe on your favorite streaming platform, follow us on social media, and enjoy the show. In today's episode of Compendium Trivia, we are going to explore the surprising history of the kings and emperors of Haiti. Yes, you heard it right. Haiti, which is today known for a very shaky government system, to put it mildly, used to have its own monarchy in the past. So hit that subscribe button and let's dive into this fascinating history. So first things first, a bunch of Haiti facts. It is located in the heart of the Caribbean region, roughly between Cuba, Jamaica, and Puerto Rico. It lies on the western part of the island of the same name, Haiti, also known as Hispaniola. And the eastern part of the island belongs to a separate country, the Dominican Republic, which you may know from vacation brochures or room advertisements. The island where Haiti lies was discovered by Europeans in the late 15th century, actually by Columbus, who spotted it during his first voyage. And then it was colonized by French and Spanish, who shared it between them. And the French part, known back then as the Saint-Domingue colony, quickly became the France's richest colony due to its plantations of tobacco, coffee, sugar, and other high-demand export goods. And its economy was doing so well that it even earned the nickname the Pearl of the Caribbean. So far, so good, right? Well, not exactly. And this is because this whole growth of the Saint-Domingue colony had a really dark side to it. Its first victim was the island's indigenous population, the Arawaks, who were literally wiped out by European guns and the diseases that they brought with them. And that posed a problem for the colony, a lack of manpower that they needed for the labor-intensive agricultural economy. So what was the solution to it? Well, not the most elegant one for sure, as they decided to bring slaves from Africa to work on the plantations. After all, what's colonization without some horrible human rights abuse, right? Anyway, over the next 200 years, hundreds of thousands of Africans were shipped to Haiti from the African coast. And it is estimated that it could be up to 1 million, actually. No one really knows. And the journey of those people was a pure terror. They were chained together and they slept, defecated, always in the same spot in the dark, stuffy decks of the slave ships. They never saw a ray of sunlight during their voyage. And their journey was so brutal that it is estimated that 10 to 20% of them died during the ocean crossing from Africa to the Caribbean. And after spending weeks in those inhuman conditions, the slaves must have felt relieved when they reached a port, perhaps thinking that the worst was already behind them. But their horror was actually far from over. It was just the beginning. So the welcome package for them was forced labor and violence, as they were immediately forced into the slave labor system established on the island. And the slaves were literally worked to death by their French masters. They were fed barely enough to function. And believe it or not, sometimes they were forced to wear muzzles like dogs to prevent them from eating the crops that they were harvesting. Needless to say that disease and violence were widespread, women were regularly raped, slaves were punished in horribly cruel ways for the slightest sign of disobedience or even for no reason at all, sometimes just to terrorize the others. And the whole social system of the Saint-Domingue colony was built on divisions, but not only on the axis of white colonizers versus black slaves, but also among different African tribes imported to the island and among colonizers of different social statuses. And this in turn led to a vicious circle of hatred, as it was accurately described by the French historian Paul Fregosi. I will quote: "White, mulattoes, and blacks hated each other. The poor whites couldn't stand the rich whites. The rich whites despised the poor whites. The middle class whites were jealous of the aristocratic whites. The whites born in France looked down upon the locally born whites. Mulattoes envied the whites, despised the blacks, and were despised by the whites. Free blacks brutalized those who were still slaves. Haitian born blacks regarded those from Africa as savages. Everyone, quite rightly, lived in a terror of everyone else. Haiti was hell, but Haiti was rich." So this unbalanced living hell, as Fregosi described it, was eventually reached its boiling point and exploded in 1791 when the Great Slave Uprising began, the so-called Haitian Revolution. And during this revolution, the local French population was quickly killed by the vengeance-driven slaves. The colonial powers then tried to fight back, but eventually gave up after several attempts. And eventually in 1804, Haiti declared independence. And it's worth to mention that Haiti was the first modern black nation and the first European colony to manage to break free. So a victory and a happy ending? Well, not really, but this is the moment when the first Haitian emperor mentioned in today's episode title enters the game. His name was Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and he was one of the slave leaders during the uprising. And after the fighting was over, he crowned himself Emperor Jacques I of Haiti. And you could think that he was following Napoleon Bonaparte's footsteps, who also crowned himself an emperor. But in fact, the Salines coronation ceremony took place 2 months before Bonaparte's, which I find really interesting. Jacques I, he was then followed by a king for a change, Henri Christophe, and later another emperor, Faustin Suluk. And the reigns of all these three rulers were fairly similar. Basically, they were all short-lived, brutal, rife with troubles, and all ended in a really nasty way. Under their leadership, Haiti constantly struggled economically, and while the country was technically free, the labor system in place was still not that much different from the slavery. There were also frequent internal conflicts between different factions and military commanders. And in one such rebellion, the Emperor Jack I was assassinated in 1806, just 2 years after assuming the throne. Also, foreign relations were equally challenging. There were some armed conflicts with the neighboring Dominican Republic, and Haiti lived under the constant threat of the potential French return and the European invasion. So, to prepare for such a scenario, several forts were constructed at a great expense, which depleted the country's limited resources even further. And speaking of money, Haiti's coffers were empty also thanks to the outrageous independence debt that France imposed on them in exchange for recognizing their independence. And believe it or not, but Haiti was still paying it off until 1947. So that's nearly 150 years later. It really feels like, in this case, the French took the breakup fees to a whole new level. Anyway, in those difficult circumstances, the Haitian royals, they did what they could, but managing the country was not an easy task. Also because they had an expensive taste. What I mean is that they were lavishly overspending on coronation ceremonies, luxury products imported from Europe, construction projects, all of that while their people lived in terrible poverty. Henri Christophe, for example, he built a ridiculously extravagant palace where he hosted legendary feasts and parties. And the same palace later became the scene of his downfall when he was surrounded by the enemies and he decided to commit suicide within its walls in 1820. And the palace was destroyed soon after, and now it stands in ruins, a reminder of Haiti's dramatic past. Also, Emperor Faustin made an abrupt exit as he was forced to abdicate by rebels in 1859. But at least in his case, he saved his life on British-owned Jamaica, where he lived in exile. And after Faustin was gone, Haiti ended its romance with monarchy, and the country switched to a presidential system, which was probably a good decision considering how much of a royal drama they had in such a short period of time. But the history of Haitian royals doesn't end there. There is one more character who was named an emperor of Haiti, although not officially. And actually, this man was not even born on Haiti. In fact, he was a Polish-born American named Faustin Edmond Wirkus, and he was a Marine who served on the island during the American occupation of Haiti between 1915 and 1934. And he was stationed on the Gonave region, where he met Timemen, a local spiritual leader and the unofficial queen of the locals. And he helped her by saving her from being arrested by the American soldiers. And because of the kindness he showed to her, but also due to his curious name similarity, Faustin, she saw him as the reincarnation of the Haiti's last emperor, Faustin Solok. And things really escalated quickly from there. there was a voodoo ceremony during which Virkus was coronated as the Emperor Faustin II, and he ruled the island alongside Timemen. And the locals used to call him Litepevini, which means the one who has returned, as a reference, as a successor to the previous emperor. And his rule was actually quite beneficial for the local population. Using American money, he managed to build infrastructure and generally improved the lives of the people. So it was all going well, but there was just one problem. He was still technically an American Marine, and the government wasn't thrilled about the idea of one of the occupying soldiers moonlighting as a monarch. So after 3 years of ruling his kingdom, Virkus was recalled by his superiors and sent back to the US. And he died in 1944, but not before writing a book about his rule titled The White King of La Gonave, the true story of the sergeant of Marines who was crowned king on a voodoo island. I really recommend you this read. It's a captivating story. And in the description, I've left a link where you can download it for free. And so ends the fascinating saga of the kings and emperors of Haiti. It was truly a royal roller coaster, I must say. I hope you enjoyed the ride as much as I did. Please don't forget to drop a comment, smash that subscribe button so we can keep deliver more stories like this one. Thanks a lot for listening and see you in the next one. Ciao.